There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. Phillip Island lies just off Australia's southern coast, about 2 hours from the city of Melbourne. With a permanent population of just over 10,000 people, Phillip Island attracts more than 3.5 million tourists annually. They come to see the Penguin Parade, where little penguins wander ashore at sunset, as well as surfing and motorsport events. In 1986, the Cameron family were well known on the island. Fergus Cameron was a founding shareholder of the Phillip Island Grand Prix, but day-to-day worked on the family farm. He was married to Vivienne Cameron, and the pair had 2 small children. One night in September 1986, the body of a 23-year-old woman was found inside her home in what has been described as one of the most horrific crime scenes. And then another woman went missing. Immediately, police thought they knew what had happened. But all these years later, there are still unanswered questions. A mysterious phone call, a handbag that was miraculously moved, and blood that revealed something no one was expecting. In 1993, crime writer Vicky Petratus published her first book, The Phillip Island Murder. 27 years later, she's working on a podcast with Case File about the case of Vivienne Cameron's disappearance and is hoping to finally lay the mystery to rest. Just a heads up, I interviewed Vicky remotely, and so you might hear the odd technological glitch. Apologies in advance, but stick with the story. It's a fascinating case. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Vicky Petratus, crime writer and author of The Phillip Island Murder, which has been transformed into a new Case File podcast. It's the evening of September the 22nd, 1986, when Fergus Cameron goes to visit his mistress, Beth. Who is Beth and how do they know each other?
Big question. So Fergus and Beth lived on Phillip Island, and Fergus was a farmer and he was 36 at the time, and he was married to Vivienne, and he was having an affair with Beth, who was 23. So on that night, he goes to visit her and he's the last person to admit seeing her alive.
And they worked together, didn't they? So did they meet in a sort of work setting?
Yeah, I think times were different back then, but Fergus worked at the Penguin Parade as a part-time job, and he was a farmer as well. And so he actually interviewed her for the job. And of course, nowadays that would be, you don't date anyone that you interview for a job. But I think back then it was a bit different, and they worked together at the Penguin Parade. And then he also employed her to work on his farm. And so while they struck up a relationship, they were pretty much together in all working moments.
You mentioned the Penguin Parade, which is how people might actually know of Phillip Island. Where is Phillip Island? And you've been there. How would you describe it?
Yeah, Phillip Island is a funny place. Before I started researching the book and was kind of looking at the case to write about, I hadn't really spent any time on Phillip Island. I think I had one family holiday there as a kid. But unless you've spent time on an island, you don't kind of realise how insular it is. And so it's one of the 2 islands in Western Port Bay. It's connected to the mainland by a bridge, and that seems to be... in some ways it's like entering a different world. It is very insular, and you just don't understand that if you come from the city.
You said that Fergus is at this point with Vivienne Cameron, his wife. What do we know about their relationship? Was it functional? Had they been together for a long time?
Yeah, so Fergus and Vivienne had been married for about 10 years and they had a son who was 8 and they had another son who was 5. And the marriage, I think, started off happy. And it's certainly people that I interviewed, talked about that they were in love in the beginning but the marriage deteriorated. I guess it doesn't help when the husband's having an affair. And he and Beth had been having an affair for a couple of years by the time this came to a head. And I think Vivienne knew, and Fergus in his own statement says that he didn't have a physical relationship with Vivienne anymore because he felt that would be being unfaithful to Beth. And so, I mean, you can only imagine how Vivienne must have felt as a wife. And a lot of people told me that she had lost weight and she'd had her hair coloured and something she was setting up to leave. But others say that she was really trying to be attractive for her husband. But by then, I think his attentions had certainly gone to somebody else.
And that night, which was a Monday, Vivienne called her husband Fergus's place of work to see where he was, and they told her that he'd left for the afternoon but he wasn't home yet. What happened from there? How did the rest of the afternoon into the evening play out?
It was actually his sister Marnie who called the Penguin Parade. Marnie, who lived up the road, she wanted to talk to Fergus about something, and so she called the Penguin Parade at 8, and she was told that he had left for the day. So they don't live that far from the Penguin Parade. So she left it for 20 minutes and then went up to his place. And when she got there, she said that Vivienne was sitting at the table and having a wine. And she said, "Oh, Fergus, is he home yet?" And Vivienne's like, "No." And I think you can only imagine how tense that would have very quickly become when Marnie's there saying, "But I rang the work and they said he'd left and then he doesn't come home." And so you have these two women sitting waiting for him, according to the statement of Marnie. And I guess it would have been getting more uncomfortable. And then, of course, when Fergus did get home, the estimate I think is about 9:20. He got a phone call very quickly and he went to talk on the phone. But I think there was an uncomfortable conversation that was brewing. His sister very quickly left, and then he said later, he told police that Vivienne and he had an argument and she attacked him with a wine glass. So it said that she smashed it into the side of his head, and then when he turned around, she stabbed him several times with that. I guess that story has always been maybe in contention a little bit because the police, when they did an examination of the scene, didn't find the wine glass. It was never collected. So I suppose people always wonder a bit about that. And in one of the crime scene photos, there's actually a pewter wine glass sitting on the sink. So, you look at that and you think, oh, did they even drink wine out of glasses? I'm not sure. But, that was his story. And as I say in the podcast, we only have one account of what happened that night because the two women were no longer around to give their account.
According to Fergus, when they had that big fight, had he told Vivienne that he'd been with Beth? Was that a moment where, in his mind and in his retelling to police, she had discovered this affair and she'd gotten really angry? Was that sort of the narrative?
Yeah, so that was certainly the narrative. And then he was bleeding quite a lot and she drove him to the local hospital in Cowes. And according to Fergus, she said when they pulled up, "I'm just going to get that bitch." So certainly the fight was about Beth. And a lot of people told me that she knew. Even Fergus's sister said that she knew and that she had said to her, if it wasn't Beth, it would be somebody else. And I suppose that's why people have always wondered about this, that if it could have been anyone and may have in the past been anyone, then would the anger be directed toward the other woman or would it be directed toward the husband? And I think because Beth was so young at 23, so Fergus was 36 and Vivienne was 35, and you kind of think that you'd look at that younger woman and think, oh, that's naivety, perhaps falling for someone who's married with 2 children, who's a lot older than you. So certainly, that was what he said, that she had threatened Beth. But when they went into the hospital, I interviewed on the podcast one of the nurses who treated them on the night, and she said they didn't admit what happened. And when she really pushed them and said, guys, I have to know what happened in order to know how to treat the injuries, they sort of said, oh, you fell through a plate glass door. And she certainly felt like they were trying to hide the truth, but nobody ever heard Vivienne say, yes, I hit him with a wine glass.
So they went to the hospital for treatment for him, and then they returned home later that night. I think we're getting into early Tuesday morning. What did they decide to do when they returned home?
They got home at about midnight, and according to Fergus, in his statement, he said Marnie stayed with them for, and had a discussion, and then she said that Fergus come and stay with her for a couple of days, I guess to ease the pressure and to help him keep away from the phones and keep away from work with his injuries. So then they, according to Fergus, had a conversation, and in that conversation Vivienne said, I'll leave. I will go back to Melbourne. I will leave you with the children. You can move your girlfriend in. Don't take it for granted. She'll be a great mother to them. That was according to him. And then he said she dropped him down to Marnie's house down the road, and that was the last they saw of him. Marnie said she waited up until 2 a.m. and saw Vivienne drop him off, and that was the last they saw. And, of course, sometime in the course of the night, Beth Barnard is really, really brutally murdered in her farmhouse on the other side of the island.
At this stage, no one knows what's happened to Beth. And at 3 a.m, Vivienne calls a friend and asks them to come over and look after the kids. That's a strange phone call. What exactly does she say and ask this person to do?
So Vivienne makes a phone call in the middle of the night, and she calls a friend called Robin Dixon, and she said, we're at the hospital and kids are home alone. Could you come and collect them? So Robin Dixon and her husband John, they go in the middle of the night and they collect the children and they take them back to their place. And so when they woke up the next morning and Robin Dixon, who was a teacher, was getting ready to go to work, she was kind of thinking, well, what do I do with these kids? I have to go to work. So she was trying to ring Vivienne and Fergus, and she couldn't get onto them. And then she finally got onto Fergus's brother, Donald Cameron, and said, I've got the kids, what's the emergency? I can't get a hold of them and I need to go to work. And so she agreed to send the older boy to school with her children, and Cameron went and picked up the younger boy and brought him back to his house. So they all lived very close to each other, the family. And it was then that they started to say, well, look, where's Vivienne? And Fergus, when he heard that Vivienne had gone missing or wasn't answering the phone, and that she had in fact given the kids to somebody else in the middle of the night, he told police later that he immediately became concerned for Beth because of the threat that Vivienne had made the night before, and he sent his brother and his brother-in-law over to check on Beth. And by the time the two other fellows got to the police station and reported it, they sort of said, oh, look, Beth's not well. And then the police went out, and, of course, she wasn't not well. She was well and truly deceased by that point.
And the scene that those two men walked into, what sort of manner had Beth been killed in, and what were they confronted with when they walked in?
Yeah, when Don Cameron and Ian Cairns walked into the house, they saw it was a really interesting crime scene, and I'm not a crime scene expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I've done a lot of reading on this, and what they were confronted with was that all of Beth's injuries were in fact covered by a doona, and so she had injuries from pretty much the nose down, and that was where the doona came up to. So while they could see very clearly that she was no longer alive, and there was sort of blood around her head area, they didn't see anything. They just saw the top of her head and blood, but they didn't see any injuries. So whoever had killed Beth had covered her. They'd actually gone into another room and covered her with a doona. I always wondered about that because it was very much, well, whoever found her won't see what I've done. But, of course, underneath the doona was a different matter, and it wasn't until the CIB detective, I think the first police officer on the scene, Cliff Ash, pinched the doona and raised it a little bit and saw that her throat had been cut. But it wasn't until the CIB detective got there and he lifted the doona right up, and that's when he saw that a huge letter A had been carved into her chest, ostensibly for adulteress.
And for any listeners who might not have read the Scarlet Letter or don't understand the reference, what does that letter A mean?
Well, that's what the police thought that it could mean. We don't know for certain because Vivienne or the perpetrator, whoever did it, was never caught. But according to Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, it's all about Hester Prynne, who had a baby out of wedlock in Puritan settlement, and she was condemned to wear the Scarlet Letter A sewn into all of her clothes forever so that everybody would know that she was an adulteress.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Vicky Petratus, crime writer and author of the Phillip Island Murder, which has been transformed into a new Case File podcast. So at this stage, there's a young woman who's been killed, and in terms of a motive and a potential suspect, there's Vivienne. Are police searching for her? Is there any trace of where she is by the next morning?
Yeah, from the moment that Beth was found, the police were told about the fight the night before, and they knew that Fergus had been injured. They knew that Vivienne had made a threat against her, and so Vivienne was pretty much suspect number one. It seems to me as a researcher that the one and only suspect, because she was missing, and so the police set out to find her. And this is, I guess, another piece of the puzzle, was that the Cameron family Land Cruiser was missing. And it was later found kind of right near the bridge in full view later on that afternoon by one of the members of the family. But I guess the mystery was that the police, all the police, had driven past it for the whole day. You have to ask the question, was it there all day, or did somebody put it there a bit later on? Because it wasn't until I was writing the next book after the Phillip Island murder that I wrote, and I was doing a ride-along with the police at Frankston. And at the beginning of the shift, they said, there's a stolen car, keep a lookout for it. And I'd made a note of it in my notepad as I was taking notes. And it was hours and hours later, and I'd forgotten all about it. And in the middle of the night, we turned into the street, and both of the cops in the front seat of the car went, "Yep, there it is." And I went, "What?" They said, "The car that we're looking for." And it was that moment that I had this sort of blinding revelation that police are really, really good at spotting cars. And it just made me wonder afresh how all of them could have driven past that car parked in full view of the bridge all day. But of course, when the car was found, there was no evidence in it to indicate that whoever had driven it had in fact been the one to Beth. So there was no transference, there was no Beth's blood, there was no weapon that was used. What was found in the car was Vivienne's handbag, which ironically had been seen by the people that picked the children up in the middle of the night. So it sort of meant that if Vivienne had gone off to kill Beth in the middle of the night, and then the police wondered whether she jumped off the Phillip Island Bridge, but in the between time, she would have had to have gone back to collect the handbag because that was last seen at the house. And so the car, I think it raised more questions than what it answered. But police, they immediately started searching under the bridge. They had police divers, they had police searching the mud flats where a body might wash up if it did jump off the bridge. And there was a really, really extensive land and sea and air search for Vivienne, but no trace of her was ever found. And then the coroner concluded that she had in fact jumped off the bridge, but I've never met anyone that said, yeah, that's a likely way for her to end things.
The timeline, as you suggested, does get a bit strange with the handbag and also with the car. And another question that's raised is about a very unusual phone call from Vivienne at 10 o'clock the next morning. Who did she call and what did she say?
Yeah, so Vivienne called a local woman called Glenda Frost, and she and Glenda worked together at the community house. And it was an everyday phone call, and it was a phone call that happened in the presence of a friend of Glenda's who'd only come up the night before to stay with Glenda. and the friend knew Vivienne. So when Glenda said, "Oh, it's just Viv," the friend's like, "Oh yeah, she knew her." And it was literally about getting a patchwork house present for a mutual friend, Isabel, who was retiring from the community house. So it was just a phone call that, it was Vivienne. Glenda was absolutely certain of that. It was about a subject that nobody else would have known about. And Glenda's absolutely certain that it happened. But, the coroner didn't take that into account in his findings. He found that Vivienne drove to Beth's, killed Beth, and then drove to the bridge and jumped off. So Glenda, with all of her certainty and her friend Pam to back her up, they just weren't believed. And even today, I think police just think, "Oh no, she must have been mistaken." But I've spoken to Glenda so many times over the years, and she's absolutely certain that it was Vivienne and that the phone call was the morning after. And even when they reported it to police, the detective said, "Do you mean to say that we've had divers searching for her under the bridge and you were talking to her on the phone?" They're like, "Yep." But it just didn't fit with the official story, and it didn't fit with certainly the coroner just dismissed it. And I think that it's always been, I guess, a passion of mine to find a theory or to find a solution in this case that fits with all the evidence. And you can't kind of pick and choose. You can't say, "Oh, that Glenda Frost phone call never happened." I think you have to say, well, could it have been her? Could she still have been alive then? But of course, the question is, one of the detectives said to me, "But it couldn't have been her because if you did what she did to Beth, you couldn't make a regular phone call the next day. You'd be in shock or, there'd be an aftermath." And so I suppose the question that has to be asked, well, what if she didn't do it? And no one's ever gone to trial over this. So this is the enduring mystery because Vivienne literally vanished off the face of the earth. And I suppose until we get an answer, we're just left to ask a lot of questions.
In terms of physical evidence, was there evidence to suggest that Vivienne was in that room with Beth that night? Because obviously, as you say, there was a lot of blood. It was a very violent, frenzied attack. Was there physical evidence to place Vivienne there as the potential culprit?
There were a couple of items that there's always been questions over them. So right from the start, police found 2 drops of blood on the path outside of Beth's place, and that blood was A-type blood, which was Vivienne's type. Because remember, back in 1986, there was no DNA. These things have since been tested for DNA, and the results were what we always thought they were. So that blood turned out to be consistent with Vivienne's blood. And Vivienne's blood was found on a towel in Beth's bathroom and a hand towel in the Land Cruiser. But really, these items are portable, and I suppose that the question has to be asked. A hand towel and a towel was seen at the Cameron farm before Vivienne even had a chance to do it. So you kind of wonder, could someone have put them there, or could Vivienne have taken them there? So there's very little. And transference, the law of transference is really about creating this nexus between victim and offender. And Vivienne would have been covered in blood. The injuries were so severe that she should have transferred blood evidence to the Land Cruiser, but there was none. There was no other, apart from those 2 droplets out on the path. There were no fingerprints found. Later on, the police said that her DNA was found on the knife lying next to the body, but there was a lot of question as to whether that knife was the knife that killed Beth. They never proved that it was. There were injuries and cuts in the fabric of Beth's T-shirt that she was wearing that suggested a different kind of knife. So the evidence just made things a little bit more confusing. And then, of course, at the Cameron house, there was quite a lot of blood on quite a lot of items, but that turned out to be Vivienne's blood. And this is another big question. That blood was seen by Marnie, who came to mind the Cameron children when Fergus and Vivienne first went to the hospital. And she said, we saw blood on the bed in the spare room and we saw blood on the floor in the spare room. And so she talks about that in her statement. But that blood was later found to be Vivienne's. And yet Vivienne is at the hospital and she's not injured. So, again, raised more questions than it answered.
What did Vivienne's friends say about her? You suggested that she did know about the affair, which then raises questions about a frenzied attack if it wasn't brand new information. But what sort of person was she? Was she connected to her children? What was she aware of? What was her temperament?
I think it's funny, but the type of person that she was has added to people's inability to conclude that she did it. So people described her as an earth mother, and they described her as being very calm and absolutely devoted to her children, and the kind of woman who would bring you a casserole if you were going through a hard time, or arrive on your doorstep with a bottle of wine to make you feel better. So she was really, really admired in a quiet way. She wasn't the life of the party. She wasn't big and loud, but she was one of those quiet and very kind people who was very calm. And I guess because she was like that, her friends find it really, really difficult to believe that someone of that demeanour could then, in one night, become a really ferocious and brutal killer. And maybe because of what the friends knew she was like, from their point of view, they just refused to accept it.
There are a number of question marks that you bring up in your research, and another was that the attack was so brutal, and according to research that you've done, it's unusual for a woman to kill another woman in such a violent way. What are some of the other question marks that still remain for you in terms of this theory that it was Vivienne?
I always wonder, or I always ponder, that if she stepped forward today and said, "Here I am," and then she said, "I didn't do it," I wondered if the police actually had enough evidence to prove that she did. And I don't think there is enough. If she stepped forward and said, "I didn't do it," I don't think they would be able to prove otherwise. I don't think there's enough there. And for me, it's always been about a sense of justice. And if Vivienne didn't do it, then that means that Beth's murder has finished. And I guess all of us just want to know for sure. So that to me has been the biggest thing. Would there be enough evidence to convict her if she surfaced today?
And finally, I wanted to ask, you've been looking at this case for decades now. What do you think happened? Are you allowed to tell us? Do you think that Vivienne did it, or that she acted alone, or that she acted at all?
My personal opinion is I've got no idea what happened. But what I do know is that the evidence doesn't necessarily support the coroner's finding. And I mean, the coroner found that she jumped off the bridge at 1 o'clock. I mean, even according to Fergus's statement, he's still talking to her at 1. So, I mean, even that can't have happened. I interviewed the local CIB detective who said, "I searched every inch of that bridge and did not see any break in the salt crust. Nobody went over the edge." So, I mean, as a researcher, the findings have to be provable. And in a court of law, they have to be provable. So I think that I'm just hoping, and this has started to happen already, I was hoping that the podcast would give it one last go at saying, look, here's the story, here's everything that we know to date. If there are people out there that had another piece of information, we would love to hear it. And already we've had several people come forward with what I think is important information. And one piece in particular about the Land Cruiser being seen at a time when it should have been in the Cameron shed was, according to the person who contacted me, was given to the police at the time. But that doesn't factor into any of the statements. So you've got to wonder, was there other information that people came forward with at the time that just it didn't fit with the official story, and why was it acted on? So look, we're just kind of sitting back and waiting now and hoping that there are people out there that know something. And like you said at the beginning, an island is a really funny place. It is a very insular community. But what I'm really hoping is that the people, if they do know something, that their sense of justice and fairness maybe rises above. But I just really hope that there are people that say this needs to be just and there needs to be a fair ending to this.
Thank you so much for your time, Vicky. We really appreciate it.
It's been lovely chatting.
Thank you to my guest, Vicky Petratus. And you can listen to the new Case File series, The Vanishing of Vivienne Cameron, on Spotify. If you know anything about the disappearance of Vivienne Cameron or the murder of Beth Barnard, then you can visit thephillapislandpodcast.com and contact Vicky Petratus directly. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri. Our executive producer is Zoe Ferguson. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.